It really does help us out. It gets this in front of more people, which is always a good thing. It really keeps us making it. I like reading the reviews, so does that. And let's get into today's episode.
Those being photographed shirtless and alongside wild animals, perhaps at the same time, Vladimir Putin has cultivated an image as an intimidating and fearless figure on the world stage. He's a martial arts expert, a fearless political actor, and a former spy. His resume holds a certain cachet in the West. As a former KGB agent, he's automatically associated with secrecy, intimidation, and the old fears Americans had of the Soviet Union for much of the 21st century. Putin has said of himself that he lives a long time as an ordinary person, and ordinary is interesting to note he hasn't been anything but ordinary as he's spent his life climbing the ranks of the Russian government, moving farther and farther away from his ordinary roots. Christian. During Putin's childhood, his mother stayed at home and his father, a veteran of World War II, worked in a factory. As an interesting aside here, his grandfather was a cook who worked for Vladimir Lenin and even prepared meals for Stalin a few times. The Putin family, they lived in a communal apartment shared by 3 families, a home where Putin says he used to hunt rats in the stairwell, perhaps a precursor to his later fascination with hunting and with wild animals in general. Now, growing up, Putin didn't prove himself to be anything particularly special in his early years, but then, by the age of 12, he discovered athletic competition. It was in the midst of a competition that Putin began to set himself apart. Martial arts was his chosen sport, particularly Sambo and Judo. Though his mother did not initially approve of his participation in these sports, Putin proved himself to be a worthy and skilled competitor in both. At one point, his coach even showed up at the Putin home to speak with his mother about how much promise Vladimir showed. Well, it was actually that did the trick, and his parents began to support his athletic pursuits. Putin now holds a black belt in Judo and has continued to compete in both Sambo and Judo, establishing himself as the first world leader to be at an advanced level in these sports. He also remains the president of the same dojo he practiced in while growing up. Though he established himself as athletically talented, Putin did not excel academically in school during his childhood. He attended a local school for his early years and then attended a magnet school focused on chemistry. He didn't push himself, but his teachers saw that he did have potential and they encouraged him to focus as much on his schoolwork as he did on his martial arts practice. It was in the 6th grade when Putin really began to push himself, and that showed in his grades. He was welcomed to the Young Pioneers, the youth group that was run by the Communist Party. It was a serious mark of honor, as Putin had previously been one of only a few from the class who had not been welcomed into the organization. Now, from 1970 to 1975, Putin continued his studies at St. Petersburg State University. While there, he studied law and was required to join the Communist Party. He later left the party, denouncing communism in 1991, when he said of Marxism-Leninism that it became more and more obvious for me, more obvious truth, that it was nothing more than a beautiful and harmful fairy tale. At St. Petersburg State University, Putin met Anatoly Sobchak, who would become a key figure in Putin's political success. Sobchak was an assistant professor at the school, but he actually went on to co-author the Constitution of the Russian Federation and was also the first democratically elected mayor of St. Petersburg. Putin graduated from St. Petersburg State University in 1975, and it was then that he joined the KGB. The KGB was the Soviet Union's security agency for much of the 20th century. It was created in 1954 and continued to operate until 1991, when the Soviet Union itself was dismantled. Translated to English, KGB stands for State Security Committee. It had a reputation for oppression and monitoring the actions and opinions of Soviet citizens. The KGB, it was a truly frightening organization for democracy, and and an indication of the dangers of communism to Westerners. The organization quelled rebellions and kept a close eye on anyone suspected to be in opposition to the Soviet regime. Putin started his career with KGB in Leningrad, but he was later moved to Dresden, Germany. Before his transfer to Germany, Putin married. To this very day, Putin keeps his home life very private, and information about his family is very closely guarded. He and his wife, Lyudmila, were married from 1983 until their divorce in 2013. Their divorce, it was seemingly amicable, with no specific reason given for it, though Lyudmila made references to Putin's dedication to his work and the time investment required to serve as world leader. They have two daughters together, Maria and Yekaterina, both of whose lives remain incredibly secret. They both used fake names to go and register for college, and it's not entirely known in which country either of the Putin daughters currently lives. In 2016, European newspapers even described Maria as a secret daughter, noting that she had not been known to be photographed during the entire length of Putin's time in power. For a former spy and a man with many, many enemies, it's perhaps sensible that his daughters have maintained this secret life. Putin indeed has stated, "I have a private life in which I do not permit interference. It must be respected." So Putin, he moved with his family to Dresden, where he served with the KGB for 5 years. He was fluent in German and still speaks this language to this day, and he stated that he actually feels more comfortable using German than English. Putin served in this Dresden post from 1985 to 1990, working as a multiple agent, playing the part of a translator. The work, though not all of what Putin did is known, as a spy after all, it wasn't particularly interesting. Much of it was simply amassing information on people, ensuring that they remained loyal to the Soviets and were not plotting any kind of revolution. In 1989, though, the situation became rather more dicey for the Soviets who were stationed in Dresden during what is clear that East Germany was moving up to Soviet the KGB headquarters in Dresden. Putin was in the Soviet military for help, but he was told that nothing could be done for them unless Moscow gave the order, something that Moscow never did. While Putin and his colleagues, well, they survived their day, it has become increasingly clear that the situation was unstable. During this time, Putin and other KGB agents began burning files, so that when the day came that their headquarters was overtaken or abandoned, or both, no files would be left in the hands of their enemies. The Berlin Wall fell in November of 1989, and soon after, Putin and his family, they returned to Russia. By this point, Putin held the rank of lieutenant colonel in the KGB. However, the KGB was nearing the end of its existence, and Putin was able to find work at the State University of St. Petersburg. He was no ordinary professor, though. He was still working for the KGB. Part of his job included keeping an eye out for students who showed promise as potential new KGB recruits. Through his job, Putin was also able to reconnect with his former professor, Anatoly Sobchak. Sobchak, he was elected the mayor of St. Petersburg in 1991, and Putin joined his team as an advisor. He worked for Sobchak until 1996. When Sobchak lost re-election, Putin could have opted to continue working for his successor, but Putin believed that taking a job with Sobchak's political opponent would be disloyal, and he instead chose to move to Moscow to begin working with the Yeltsin administration. During Boris Yeltsin's presidency, Putin rose through the ranks, first serving as deputy chief administrator for the Kremlin, Russia's version of the White House, and by 1999 he was named secretary of the Security Council and became Yeltsin's chief advisor on matters of foreign relations and intelligence. But it was then that Putin's career got a real boost. Yeltsin decided he didn't want to keep his current prime minister, so he got rid of him. That was in August of 1999, and Putin, well, he was the beneficiary of this decision as Yeltsin named Vladimir Putin to the post. Yeltsin offered Putin the position of a prime minister with prospects, somewhat foreshadowing the next step in Putin's career, because only months after naming Putin as prime minister, Boris Yeltsin himself stepped down, and Vladimir Putin became the acting president of Russia, and that was in December of 1999. Then, only 3 months later, in March of 2000, Putin, he was officially elected and became president of Russia in his own right. 10 opponents ran against him for president, but he won. And for the first time in Russia's history, there was a peaceful transfer of power to a democratically elected president. Putin used his first term to advocate for certain international policies, including approval of the START II arms treaty and improving relations with China. Putin was also initially supportive of the United States' war on terror that followed the 9/11 terrorist attacks, but he did not support the United States' invasion of Iraq. During Putin's first summer in power, tragedy struck Russia when the Kursk submarine sank in the Barents Sea in August. Putin, he was on vacation when the sinking occurred, and he did not immediately return home to address the deaths of all 180 crew members who had been on board. Then, when he was asked what went wrong with the Kursk, Putin replied starkly that it was sank. Distraught But despite all of this, opinion polls showed that overall his image did not sustain much damage from the tragedy. Indeed, 4 years later, the Kursk tragedy did not affect his re-election at all. In 2004, the Russians re-elected him to a second term as their president. And they were apparently really pleased with the job he was doing, as Putin received over 70% of the vote. During his first term in office, Putin focused on economic reforms. Having denounced communism, he instead supported an economic system that was essentially capitalism with very strict regulations and oversight. After years of economic struggle, Russia was finally beginning to see a stabilizing and even growing economy under Putin. Some reports put Russia's growth during his first term at 7% annually. Indeed, he's still remembered favorably for this growth, though it came with increased nationalization of industry and, in part because of the mid-2000s global financial crash, the growth did not last. But in the country, his economy was in disarray for nearly the entire decade before Putin's rise to power. An era of growth in which disposable income nearly doubled was reason for the people to think really positively of Putin. Now, Putin did work on those economic policies we already mentioned in his first term, but he also made strides in foreign relations, including making a historic trip to Israel. This was the first ever trip by a Russian leader to the country. Conversations between Putin and Israeli leaders focused largely on security issues. The trip that garnered much attention around the world as it came in the midst of strengthening ties between Russia and Israel, though the two nations disagreed on topics such as the Russian sale of missiles to Syria. The trip was also seen as a move by Putin to help secure Russia's position as a key diplomatic actor in any Middle East peace discussions or agreements. Now, security issues were present not just abroad, though, and homeland security would become a major focus for Putin. Unfortunately, this is something that became really clear during the horrific tragedy at the Beslan school in 2014. In September, terrorists held over 1,000 people hostage at the Beslan school in North Ossetia. Nearly 800 of these hostages, they were children. For 3 days, these terrorists demanding Chechen independence from Russia held these people hostage. The situation had a tragic ending when tanks, rockets, and other artillery were used by the Russian military to try to clear the school. Special forces entered the school after hearing explosions from inside where the hostages were being kept, but their actions, they did not save lives. Quite the contrary. In the siege of the school, over 300 people died, nearly 2/3 of whom were children. The tragedy, it shook the world, and while the government was cleared of any wrongdoing initially, the European Court of Human Rights later stated that Russia had used excessive force and lacked caution when they stormed the school. Despite anger and discontentment at the government's handling of the tragedy in general, it did not affect the public's view of Putin very much at all. Quite the opposite, in fact. A poll taken after the Beslan massacre stated that 83% of Russians were still happy with him. The Beslan tragedy did lead to changes in the halls of Russian power, though primarily giving more power to the Russian president. For instance, instead of electing governors in regions like North Ossetia and Chechnya, the president gave power to appoint governors. In 2007, during the second term of Putin, was named Time Magazine's Person of the Year. The magazine called the final year of his second term his most successful yet, and the cover photo for the issue, a portrait of Putin, won the photographer the World Press Photo Award. During the shoot, the two discussed their mutual admiration for the Beatles. This connection helped Putin become more comfortable and gave the photographer the chance to get an award-winning shot of the intimidating world leader. No matter how popular Putin was, though, the Russian people could not elect him to a third term. The Russian constitution simply forbid it. However, Putin found a way around this rule just when his time in office was about to run out. President presidential terms in Russia had been extended to 6 years, but this change did not benefit Putin. He was beholden to the previous constitutional rules. So, how did he get to stay in power? Well, the man who was elected Russia's next president was Dmitry Medvedev, and he was a protege of Putin's and had benefited from Putin's rise to power. Neither he nor Putin wanted Putin to be pushed off the international stage, and so Medvedev named Putin as Russia's prime minister, a position he had previously held under Boris Yeltsin. After 13 years in leadership, Putin would remain at the highest levels of Russia's government. He and his supporters were able to keep him in power and stay in line with the law, although perhaps not exactly in line with its exact intent. During his third time as prime minister from 2008 to 2012, Putin focused on dealing with the economic crisis that swept the world, as well as Russia's population problems. Russia's population was falling by 1 million people a year, a devastating number for a country whose population is only 150 million. In 2010, the trend reversed, and Russia's population began to grow. The reversal is in part credited to Putin's economic reforms. When people have more money, it is easier to support a larger family. One of Putin's economic reforms included joining the World Trade Organization, or WTO, in 2012. Negotiations for Russia to join the WTO lasted nearly 2 decades, as they had started after the fall of the Soviet Union. Russia was granted entry into the WTO after negotiations reached a point which granted Russia permission to phase in the opening of markets while it aligned with other WTO trading requirements. Now, while this political party retained dominance and Putin was again the candidate for president in 2012, he did not escape politically unscathed from his maneuver to hold on to power by sidestepping the term limits. The elections in 2012 were heavily protested, with claims of fraud tainting Putin's election to a third term. The task of the government is not only to pour honey into a cup, but sometimes to give bitter medicine. But despite those protests, well, he was inaugurated in May of 2012, and this time his term would be 6 years. This means that Putin will be president of Russia until at least 2018, and with allegations of his interference in United States elections, his prominence in the world, well, it only seems to grow. Putin has continued to be re-elected and reappointed to positions at the highest level of Russian government. But his time in office, it's not been without questions surrounding his shady actions. Among the high points, or low points we should say, of intrigue surrounding Putin are the murders of Russian journalists. Deaths of journalists were a point of concern in Russia long before Putin's rise to power, but the issue, well, it began to get a lot of international attention during Putin's second term as president, when journalist Anna Politkovskaya was murdered. This journalist had been a strong critic of Putin, and particularly the war in Chechnya. Even before her death, she was even poisoned, but ultimately recovered. Her murder, it remains to this day unsolved, but there is suspicion that Putin and his government, well, maybe they targeted her. Politkovskaya is also far from the only Putin opponent whose death has occurred in suspicious circumstances. In March of 2017, the Washington Post even published a list of 10 such deaths. Among these deaths was a former deputy prime minister and Putin critic who was shot outside the Kremlin. He was a tycoon whose death was initially called a suicide, but now that's rather unsure. There's also a journalist who was kidnapped and shot in the woods, and a former KGB agent who was found to be poisoned by Russian agents. Then there's the journalist who died by a mysterious illness, and whose medical records are concealed. Certainly, failing intrigue here. Though many of these deaths may never be proven beyond doubt to be the work of Putin's government, one thing is absolutely certain. Vladimir Putin does not like to be viewed as weak. He has done all he can to prove his strength and show the world that he is strong and manly. Beyond his active participation in martial arts, he shows his power and dominance by hunting, tracking, and posing with wild animals. He's caught huge fish, including a 46-pound pike, and shot a crossbow at a whale, only to tranquilize it though. He also saved a camera crew from a Siberian tiger that was about to attack them while on a tour of a wildlife sanctuary. Further, he's actually got close enough to polar bears to attach a tracking device to them for a research project. Now, polar bears might look cute and you might not think this is particularly dangerous, but they're actually incredibly vicious creatures. Putin has also attached himself to an experimental flying machine to accompany birds on migration. And it's important to note that he always does these things, carefully making sure that they're perfect for Russia's presence. The more I know about people, the more I like dogs. I like simple animals. When he's not hanging out with wild animals, Putin makes time for other adventures adventurous and athletic activities. He dives in the Black Sea, explores shipwrecks, plays hockey, rides snowmobiles and motorcycles, and has even driven a Formula One race car. Once, during a visit to a Russian youth camp, he even challenged attendees to arm wrestle with him. Then, not content with arm wrestling as a show of strength, he tried to bend a frying pan with his bare hands. Naturally, there were photographers on hand to capture all of these incredible moments, and the photos have been distributed and widely viewed around the world. You've probably seen several of them. From his days at school cultivating an athletic reputation to his time as president and prime minister, Putin has made it known that he is a man to be reckoned with. During his most recent term as president, with a couple of years left to go, Putin has found himself centered on the world stage. Russia has been involved in the Syrian civil war, supporting the government of Bashar al-Assad. In early July of 2017, Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump announced a ceasefire in southwestern Syria, and weeks later, Russia announced that it had signed a deal with Syria, allowing Russia to keep its airbase in the country for at least 50 more years. In addition to Syria, perhaps Putin's most talked about involvement has been the alleged interference of Russia in the US election. From hacking allegations to questions of illicit meetings and deals with members of Trump's inner circle, the US and the world media have made Putin and his political dealings a household conversation topic. So, Vladimir Putin, he began his life growing up in a communal apartment in the midst of Russia during the Cold War, and has become an internationally polarizing figure. He's been strong and unapologetic in his foreign policy and use of force, and questions swirl around his treatment of political opponents and critical journalists. Putin, he's unwilling to sit back, be a shrinking violet on the world stage, ensuring Russia remains a world power with a great deal of influence. He has done all that he can to cultivate an image of strength, both for Russia as a country and for himself personally, showing no signs of stopping his adventurous and daredevil lifestyle, even as he enters his 60s. Vladimir Putin, he has undoubtedly made a place for himself in world history, and with him eligible for re-election in 2018, we may still have many years of Putin on the world stage ahead of us.
So I really hope you enjoyed that episode of the Biographics podcast. Leave us a review. Why not? You can do that wherever you get your podcasts, or a rating, or however these things work. I like reading them. It makes me feel good when they're positive. It lets me know what you don't like when they're negative. Also, if you want to say hi, let me know how I'm doing with this podcast, just drop me an email. It's simon@biographics.org. Biographics spelled the same way that the name of this podcast is spelled. So again, that's simon@biographics.org. Drop me an email, say hi, let me know how you like this podcast, and as always, see you next time. Hi, and welcome back to another episode of the Biographics podcast. My name is Simon Whistler. This is a podcast version of a video that originally aired on our YouTube channel. You can find that by searching YouTube for Biographics. If you like this audio version of that video, please do consider leaving us a review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps. And let's get into today's podcast.
Imagine traveling in a foreign country when you learn the news of your father's death. Now imagine that death means you are now at the helm of the British Empire. This is how Queen Elizabeth II discovered that she would no longer be a princess, but instead would be the queen of the most powerful empire in history. She was only 25 years old and would soon become the head of one of the world's most powerful monarchies, a post she would hold for much of the 20th century. Elizabeth wasn't even supposed to be queen, but as the old saying goes, when humans plan, leaves. Elizabeth was born on April 21st, 1926 to the Duke and Duchess of York. Her father, Prince Albert, was at that time the second in line to the monarchy, following the current king, George V, and his older brother, Edward, Prince of Wales. And should her parents or Prince Albert have had a son, the male heirs would jump ahead of Elizabeth in the line of succession. It was Elizabeth's uncle, Edward, the Prince of Wales, whose behaviour altered this line of succession. In love with an American divorcee, Edward abdicated the throne in 1936 amid a public uproar about his love life. Elizabeth's father became King George VI, and Elizabeth became the next in line to the throne at the age of just 10. Reportedly, Elizabeth's younger sister Margaret told her, "You," upon learning the line of succession. Now, before the family was thrust into the role of monarchs, Elizabeth, Margaret, and their parents lived a relatively quiet life, split between homes in London and the countryside. Elizabeth was educated at home by a governess. She wasn't around children her own age, with the exception of Instead of Elizabeth, she said Lilibet. As a result, the nickname stuck, and it was what her close family would come to know her as. As Elizabeth grew older and became next in line to the throne, more emphasis was placed on formal education. As a 12-year-old, she was taught constitutional history from a member of Eton's faculty, and the Archbishop of Canterbury was her religious instructor. It wasn't exactly what you'd call a typical education. But it wasn't all dry scholastic studies. Being the daughter of the king certainly did have its perks. To help Elizabeth's social reach and outdoors education, a Buckingham Palace chapter of the Girl Guides was started. Each Wednesday afternoon, 20 fortunate girls were welcome to the palace to take part in outdoors-orientated activities and be part of the future queen's social circle. But alas, the comfortable, innocent childhood of Elizabeth, it was not to last. Coming of age in the 1930s, her life would be affected by World War II before she turned 15. By 1939, England was at war, and though pressure mounted to send Elizabeth and Margaret to Canada, their mother would hear of no such thing. Instead, they were sent to live at Windsor Castle in 1940. This served two purposes: keeping Elizabeth and Margaret safer than they might otherwise be in London, but also helping to show the strength of the country in a time of terrible upheaval and fear. If England was safe enough for the princesses, then it was safe enough for the rest of the country too, and Brits should be proud and patriotic to do their duty for the war, just like the young princesses were doing. Now, while the royal sisters were staying in a castle and were closely watched over, that does not mean the princesses were completely exempt from all the fears and uncertainty that comes with war. While they were staying at Windsor Castle, hundreds of bombs were dropped in the area, and like so many of their countrymen, Elizabeth and Margaret were roused from bed in the middle of the night, rushed to bomb shelters, and kept on constant alert for the air raid siren. In October of 1940, at the age of 14, Elizabeth gave a radio address that was heard throughout England and North America. She discussed the situation that she and Margaret were in, talking about how they understood what their evacuated peers were feeling. They talked about being separated from their loved ones and living in a world turned upside down by violence. But Elizabeth, she wanted to do more for her country than just speak on the radio. She was not yet 18, though, and it wasn't until nearly the end of the war that she was given the opportunity to serve as a trainee ambulance driver. She learned about car repair, and photos of her working became iconic images of the British war effort. On the VE Day, she wore her uniform and stood on the balcony with Prime Minister Churchill and her parents. Elizabeth, she was not yet queen, but even as a teenager, she had shown herself to be quite the leader. So the war ended in 1945. Its aftermath remained, even for royalty. When Elizabeth married 2 years after the end of the war, she purchased the fabric for her wedding gown using ration coupons. But that didn't mean her dress was a dreary affair. It was made of silk and decorated with over 10,000 pearls. Her groom, well, that was Prince Philip of Greece, a man who'd been in and out of Elizabeth's life since she was 13 years old. As second cousins, they saw each other at family functions throughout their lives. Teenage Elizabeth had been intrigued by Philip since meeting him in her early teens, but it was when Elizabeth was 17 and he was 22 that the prince began to consider marrying her. Now, as we did mention, they were second cousins, but such a marriage between cousins is really unusual for royalty. Philip was born in Greece and was a member of the line of succession to the Greek throne. However, he gave up his position in the line of succession to become a naturalized British citizen. The night before their wedding, he was made the Duke of Edinburgh. The two, they announced their engagement in July of 1947, celebrating the happy occasion with a garden party. In photos from the party, Elizabeth is unabashedly excited, while Prince Philip gazes down at her adoringly. Only 4 months later, in November of 1947, the two were married in a ceremony at Westminster Abbey. The Archbishops of Canterbury and York performed the rite with royalty around the world in attendance. attendance. 200 million commoners were able to listen in via a BBC radio broadcast. After the ceremony, Elizabeth and Philip, with Elizabeth still wearing her wedding gown, waved to cheering crowds from the balcony of Buckingham Palace. Shortly after, Elizabeth gave birth to their first child, Prince Charles, in 1948. A daughter, Anne, was added to the family in 1950. It would be over a decade before Elizabeth gave birth to her youngest sons, Prince Edward and Prince Andrew. As an interesting aside here, Elizabeth was serving as Queen when Prince Edward, which makes her the first Queen in England's history to give birth while holding the title. It was her husband, Philip, who had the difficult duty of passing the word to his wife that her father had passed. The two knew he was ill. In fact, they were travelling in Kenya because the king was not well enough to travel internationally, so his daughter and son-in-law took on the duty. The trip was supposed to include travel to Australia and New Zealand, but of course, news of the king's death took priority over all else. Elizabeth, true to the stoic stereotype of the British, and especially the royals, reportedly did not succumb to her emotions upon hearing the news, but instead began planning the practical steps for what must come next. She and Philip, well, they returned to England, and it was on that plane flight home that she finally allowed herself to cry. Although, of course, she never did this in public. Even on that flight, she hid in the bathroom and emerged with reddened eyes, but a composed face. Years later, Elizabeth recalled the implications of taking the throne at such a young age. In a way, I didn't have an apprenticeship. My father died much too young. It's a question of maturing into something that one's got used to, and accepting the fact that here you are and it's your fate, because I think that continuity is very important. It is a job for life. Preparations for Elizabeth's coronation ceremony took over a year. Her father died in February of 1942, but the official coronation didn't occur until June of 1953. It did rain on the day of her coronation, but this did nothing to temper the excitement of the day for the British people who had watched this young woman grow up. Elizabeth was coronated in Westminster Abbey, bringing her into the line of kings and queens who had been crowned there for nearly a millennium. Not even 30 years old, Elizabeth solemnly delivered the coronation oath, which was heard by millions around the world. The ceremony, in a sign of the changing times, was the first British coronation ceremony to be televised. In her coronation speech, Elizabeth looked to the future, saying the following:
I am sure that this, my coronation, is not the symbol of a power and a splendour that are gone, but a declaration of our hopes for the future, and for the years I may, by God's grace and mercy, be given to reign and serve you as your queen.
Following the actual ceremony, Elizabeth and dozens of other dignitaries rode through the streets of London, cheered by adoring crowds. Still more applauding Brits stood and cheered her as she waved to them from the balcony of Buckingham Palace later in the evening. Elizabeth and Philip moved into Buckingham Palace after the coronation, but they did not spend much time there initially. Instead, they took off on a world tour for months of 1953 and 1954. The tour was the brainchild of Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who recognized the appeal of Queen Elizabeth to the masses and the possibilities such a favoured queen presented for building a positive image of England abroad. The royal couple, they went around the world, making Elizabeth the first European monarch to do so. She was also the first reigning British monarch to visit Australia, New Zealand and Fiji. This trip was only the first of many that Elizabeth would take as queen. During her 65 years and counting as queen, she has become the world's most widely travelled monarch. And by the way, as queen, she does have an easier time than the rest of us because of the way British and international law works, which means that she doesn't actually need to have a passport. If she did have a passport, though, it would be plenty full. She has made nearly 300 foreign trips to 120 countries, including Canada and the United States, New Zealand, Australia, India, Bermuda, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Thailand, Brazil, and Russia. These are but a few of the countries she's visited. Some of the most notable trips she's taken include the opening of Canada's Parliament, she's been the honoree at a ticker tape parade in New York City, and she's awarded the Mother Teresa Order of Merit in India, and she's also spoken at the United Nations. Travelling, it's been a large part of Queen Elizabeth's reign, but representing her nation abroad, well, that's not her only duty. As a monarch in a constitutional monarchy, she is tasked with many domestic duties. Though she does not get involved in politics, she must stay well informed of what is going on within her her country and around the world. Each day, she receives piles of reading material encased in red metal boxes. The tradition of these red boxes dates back nearly 2 centuries, and until recently, members of Parliament also received them. Parliament actually recently opted to get digital versions of these documents, but the Queen remains tied to paper delivery, so those red boxes continue to arrive daily at her door. The material contained within encompasses everything from foreign intelligence to economic updates to the most mundane matters of state. Reading and digesting the information can take several hours a day, but it is a crucial part of her role as leader. Even today, at the age of 90, she receives her red box each day and takes the time to go through the crucial information contained within it. Queen Elizabeth's more public duties include presenting fair laws issuing knighthoods and presiding over many ceremonies that take place in a society that still has a queen. As she has aged, some of Elizabeth's duties have been passed down to her children and to her grandchildren, particularly in ceremonies where the nobility receive their titles. Over the years, Elizabeth's family grew to include grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Her family, despite their royal blood, have not been immune from the ups and downs of life and love. 3 of her 4 children have been through divorces, with the world watching, and the death of Princess Diana shook the entire family, as well as the rest of the world. But it was in 1992 when much of the royal family seemed to crumble, with the marriages of Princess Anne, Prince Charles, and Prince Andrew all coming to their ends in one way or another. It was also that year that Windsor Castle caught on fire, and the public became outraged at the idea that their tax money would be used to rebuild it when the Queen was one of the richest women in the world. That year, though, the Queen demonstrated her political acumen when it was announced that the royal family would pay for the restoration of Windsor Castle, and in a reversal of a 1,000-year-old policy, the family would begin paying their taxes. Elizabeth, she has long understood the importance of public opinion. She's been the power behind the British monarchy's increased visibility in the media. She realized that the public wanted to know more about the family. They wanted to feel like they knew the royals. Increased transparency was one way to help the royal family connect with the public, and it has long been a hallmark of Elizabeth's reign. Hers was the first televised coronation, and then she was the first to allow television cameras into Buckingham Palace. Live cameras were allowed into the palace during President Nixon's visits, an informal event that included lunch and the swapping of signed photographs between the world leaders. Elizabeth also welcomed cameras into the family's lives for the production of a documentary on the royals, hoping to show them as simply humans who loved their family members. But it wasn't until 2007 that Buckingham Palace really got with the times and launched an official YouTube channel. This was 10 years after perhaps one of the most important displays of Elizabeth's use of the media to effectively communicate with the public, her speech about Princess Diana. When Princess Diana died, amid the public mourning and the private grief of the family, Elizabeth broke protocol, recognizing that the country and the world needed to hear from the royal family. Princess Diana and the Queen, they were initially close. In fact, Diana even called her mama, but over time, the relationship became, at best, strained. Diana regularly broke royal protocol and aired the dirty laundry of her and Charles's personal lives. The Queen, a stoic monarch from a rather different generation, did not understand Diana's desire to be involved with AIDS charities or her willingness to talk publicly about the disintegration of her marriage. To this day, there are people like Diana's lover, Dodi Fayed's father, who blame the Queen and the royal family for the car crash that killed Diana and his son. When Queen Elizabeth and her family did not immediately express their grief publicly, the press and the people of the world, well, they were pretty outraged. Eventually, though, Queen Elizabeth did give a live address speaking about Diana and the tragedy of her death. The Queen, she spoke of Diana in the way most of the world viewed her.
First, I want to pay tribute to Diana myself. She was an exceptional and gifted human being. In good times and bad, she never lost her capacity to smile and laugh, nor to inspire others with her warmth and kindness. I admired and respected her for her energy and commitment to others, and especially for her devotion to her 2 boys.
While public opinion didn't immediately fully rebound in the Queen's favour, the address was helpful and still applied criticism. Unlike her children, Queen Elizabeth, she had a long marriage. She and Philip had the longest marriage of anyone in the royal family. 2017 actually marks their 70th wedding anniversary. Their major wedding anniversaries had long been celebrated in England, with their 25th being marked by a party that included other couples from around England who were also married on November the 20th, 1947. In 2007, the couple sentimentally returned to their honeymoon site in the Hampshire region of England. They, like any common couple might do, recreated their honeymoon photos. At their 50th anniversary, Queen Elizabeth, in what is regarded as an emotional expression for a member of the British monarchy, said this of her husband and her marriage.
He is someone who doesn't take easily to compliments, but he has quite simply been my strength and stay all these years. And I and his whole family, and this and many other countries, owe him a debt perhaps greater than we would ever claim, or we shall ever know.
Queen Elizabeth's reign has also been punctuated by celebrations of milestones, not just in her marriage, but also in the number of reigning years. The Silver Jubilee, celebrating 25 years of her reign in 1977, was a nationwide party marked by sporting events, carnivals, concerts, and general festivities. 25 years later, in 2002, her Golden Jubilee was just as merry of an affair, even though, unfortunately, both her mother and sister died earlier in the year. Despite this occasion, Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip travelled around the world. In June, a Jubilee pageant was held to mark 50 years. One event called the Party at the Palace particularly stood out. Paul McCartney and Eric Clapton performed, and Brian May played a version of God Save the Queen. It was a raucous celebration filled with some of Britain's most recognisable celebrities, and it was watched all around the world. Thousands of people crowded London's parks and streets to see their favourite performers sing along with their favourite songs, and most of all, to cheer for their Queen. Though stoic and dutiful, Queen Elizabeth II has set herself apart as a modern monarch. She is well known to be an animal lover, and her corgis are a recognisable part of the royal family. That's almost as much as its human members. During her reign, she has had over 30 corgis as pets, and they have even been involved in public affairs, such as the opening ceremonies of the London Olympics. The corgis, though, they haven't always been as cute and cuddly as they look. At one point, the royal family reportedly had to bring in an animal psychologist to help improve the dog's behaviour when they started nipping at the many people who were around the royal residences. The Queen herself was the major where she found herself fighting corgis. These incidents, though, they did nothing to do for animals, and the Queen's corgis will forever be remembered as they are included with Elizabeth's image on such items as the Golden Jubilee commemorative coins. Apart from owning and pampering corgis, the Queen has also shown herself to be an animal lover through her support of charities. The charities she supports doesn't support animals in need. She is also generous in her donations to charities linked to the function of them. She also gives money to her church. Interestingly, she takes this money to the church in her purse, making something every day of the week when she carries money. Overall, it is estimated that the Queen's charitable efforts have resulted in over $1 billion being donated to charity. Queen Elizabeth II, she has been in the public eye since childhood. Now, in her 90s and her 65th year as Queen, she was a world leader for much of the 20th century and has helped usher in the 21st. Her reign has spanned that of 12 US presidents, 12 UK prime ministers, 7 popes, and 6 archbishops of Canterbury. She has replied to more than 3 pieces of correspondence and received thousands of birthday greetings throughout her lifetime. She has met with leaders from all corners of the world and surpassed longevity records of both British and foreign monarchs. She is one of only 5 British monarchs who have ruled for more than 50 years, and in 2015 she became the longest reigning British monarch. She's a record 20th and 21st centuries, a
appreciate it. And as always, thanks for listening. This is the Biographics Podcast. I am your host, Simon Whistler. This is an audio version of a video that originally aired on our YouTube channel. Basically, this is just another way to get it in front of a new audience. I assume if you are a podcast listener, you probably prefer just listening to the audio of things. So that's why we have this. And as always, I'll say go leave us a review, do all of that good stuff wherever you get your podcasts, and let's roll into this episode. He was a man who was impossible to ignore, a flamboyant character with a cigar and a $50,000 pinky ring. Although he weighed over 250 pounds, he could, when the occasion demanded it, move with lethal speed and force. His jowly smile contrasted with the two scars that streaked across his left cheek. Then there was his clothing. His wardrobe was nothing short of outrageous. Custom-tailored purple suits, pearl grey fedoras, and diamond-encrusted stick pins. He loved attention, wanting people to adore him, even as he ruthlessly dispatched those he had no use for. His name was Al Capone, and he has become the symbol of American greed and corruption in the 1920s and 30s. When he died on January 25th, 1947, the New York Times called him a monstrous symbol of a disease which was eating into the conscience of America. But the paper went on to say, Capone was incredible, the creation of an evil dream. Yet almost everything that the public thought they knew about him, and that most of us think we know today, is false. The product of decades of glorification and myth-making. And in today's Biographics video, we're going to peel back the layers to discover the real Al Capone. Gabrielle and Teresa Capone made the big move from Sicily to New York in 1894. They ended up in a four-room flat on Park Avenue, adjacent to the Brooklyn Navy Yard. The couple had two sons in tow, the youngest who was just a few months old. A third boy followed shortly after their arrival. A barber by trade, Gabrielle was looking for a new life in America. What he found was a city in which immigrants were viewed as lower citizens. Italians especially were vilified by Americans who blamed the spiraling crime rate that New York was experiencing on them. Like the Capones, they were a hard-working family who were trying to fit into their new society. When their fifth son Alphonse was born in 1899, the family had settled into a decent, hard existence. Life around the Brooklyn Navy Yard was pretty rough and tumble, and by the age of 10, young Al Capone had begun to exhibit the toughness and rashness that he carried into his adult life. From the start, Al emerged as a natural leader. At the age of 14, he formed the Navy Street Gang in order to protect Italian women from harassment from their Irish neighbours. By now, he had been expelled from school for punching a female teacher in the face, but you know what he said? Well, she had been first. Just prior to World War I, the Capones, they moved out to the Italian ghetto. Gabrielle's head down and get on with it attitude was paying off, and Al found himself in mobile music. Still further afield, though, was where the really wealthy people lived. This area was strictly off limits to the likes of the Capones. Teenage Al looked upon this area with envious eyes. This was where the Rockefellers lived, and the feisty teen saw no reason why he couldn't live the Rockefeller way. He just had to find a means to get it. By the age of 19, Al had become a little tough. He knew how to use a gun and a knife. He was a big, brutish brawler who could knock a man to the ground with a single punch. He also found himself a family. On December 30th, 1918, he married May Coughlin, who was 2 years older than him. 3 weeks previously, May had given birth to their son, Albert. Family life encouraged Capone to get on the straight and narrow. Intent on turning to a respectable life worthy of his wife and child, he moved the family out of the neighborhood and away from the bad influences. They shifted to Baltimore, and Al took a job as a bookkeeper. Ironically, this straight job would come in handy down the track when he was juggling millions of dollars earned from bootleg liquor. Now, that could have been the end of the story for Alphonse and May Capone. They could have settled into an uneventful life of respectability in Baltimore, maybe even work their way up the social ladder to gain some community status. But, well, as we well know, that wasn't to be. With the sudden death of his father of a heart attack, Al's flirtation with respectability was over. He returned for the funeral and soon found that the family were now looking to him for guidance as well as finance.
financial support. That would require more money than he was earning as a bookkeeper in Baltimore. Meanwhile, the local gang that Al had pulled away from an outgrowth of the Manhattan-based Five Points gang, they were at a crossroads. 6 months earlier, a mafia bigwig in Chicago named Jim Colosimo had been dead. The leader of the gang that Capone had pulled away from, Johnny Torrio, was intent on stepping into the vacuum created by Big Jim's demise. He invited Capone to join him as his right-hand man. Torrio had been grooming Capone for the last couple of years and given him a job as a collector to ensure extortion payments were made. Al, he soon graduated to become the main bouncer and bartender at the Harvard Inn on Coney Island. Now, it was one night at this establishment that Al told a female patron that she had a nice rear end. The girl's mother, she didn't take so kindly to the remark, and in an instant he carved up Capone's face with a watching lip out. The rest of his life, Al carried dual stripes down his cheek, recognized the name Scarface. Now, other than Baltimore, rumors had circulated that Al had been involved in a couple of murders. One prostitute was suspected of withholding pet money, and the other was a friend who reneged on a gambling debt. All of this was bringing unwanted police attention to the gang. Shortly after his father's funeral, Capone was caught relating with locals and they were gang. So, what's going on? Al was reported to have asked nervously. I'll tell you what's going on, Luciana replied. You gotta get the hell out of town and don't bother to pack. Luciana, he then handed Al an envelope which contained $2,000, which is about $25,000 in today's money, and directed him to go straight to Grand Central Station and head to Chicago. Al arrived in Chicago in 1921, ready, willing, and eager to learn the ropes. He left his wife and baby behind in Brooklyn with instructions to follow once it established their new life. The challenge now for Johnny Torrio, the leader of the gang, was to get Al Capone to stop using his fists and start using his brains in order to succeed in the rackets. He put Capone in the position of head bouncer and bartender at the Four Deuces, a 4-story building which served as Torrio's general offices, which also housed a saloon and cafe. The top floor of this establishment, well, that was a brothel, and Al apparently spent quite a lot of time on that floor when he wasn't exactly working. Indeed, his sexual proclivities resulted in a lifelong battle with syphilis. It was a place for the weak of heart. Countless unsolved murders took place there, with Al playing a leading hand in dispatching those who Torrio wanted eliminated. In fact, Al did so well within the year that he was made a partner, sharing in the $100,000 annual profits. Now, Torrio taught Capone how to portray an air of respectability, even as he delved deeper and deeper into the underworld. As a cover, Al opened a second-hand furniture store next door. He carried business cards announcing his occupation as furniture dealer. As Chicago authorities began to crack down on organized crime, Torrio spread his business interests into the suburbs. In the suburbs, police and politicians, well, they can be controlled easily. In fact, it was Torrio's expansion beyond Chicago that was the key to the development of the empire that Capone would eventually inherit. By the time Capone arrived in Windy City, Torrio had already set up vice, gambling, and prostitution operations in nearby town of Vernon. Then, with the election of crime-busting Chicago Mayor William E. Devine in October of 1923, the entire base of the operation was moved to the western suburb of Cicero. The plan was to make Cicero a wide-open town where the gang could peddle booze and accommodate gamblers at will. To do so, Torrio reached an agreement with the authorities to shut down his brothels in Cicero so long as he had free rein of the other two arms of his business. By cutting the police and politicians in on profits, Johnny soon developed the operation he wanted. Within 6 months of moving in, the outfit owned the town of Cicero, lock, stock, and barrel. By January of 1920, Torrio felt so confident in his position that he embarked on a trip back to the old country where he planned to set his mother up in a fine home in Venice. In his absence, Al would be in charge. Al's first challenge was to make sure that the officials who had his back would stay in office. Local elections were to be held in April. Capone was prepared to go to any lengths to keep the incumbents in office. But apparently deciding that it was futile to try and depose them. On the day of the election in Cicero, Torrio Capone gangsters used guns and fists to intimidate voters, escorting them to the ballot box and watching them drop their votes for the incumbent mayor directly into the box. Honest poll watchers and election officials were held captive until after the ballot closed. Honest citizens, obviously they were outraged at this. Some of them even called on Chicago judge Edmund D. Jarecki to do something about the Cicero gang. Jarecki deputized 70 Chicago cops who went into Cicero in plain clothes and unmarked black sedans. They seemed pretty frank going on the street, gunning it down. Like it's empty with bullets. When Al heard about his brother's slaying, the sophistication that Torrio had imbued him over the last year, he ripped him away. His savage nature was unleashed as he vowed to take revenge. That's why Torrio's persuasive style to keep him in check. But Torrio, he was not able to keep Capone out of his life. Instead, Al had Al's mind to cost the life of his brother. Torrio, he continued to preach violence and resorted to more force when these failed. But the name Capone, that was synonymous with violence. This is something that's pretty well illustrated in contemporary culture. Clip here, thanks to Capone was plagued by mayhem and a temper that he found difficult to control. Al's base nature was combative rather than diplomatic, and it resulted in an awful lot of bloodshed in the years to come. Al's pent-up emotions over the death of his brother Frank were given expression on the evening of May the 8th, 1924. His partner in a prostitution ring, Jack Cusick, had been roughed up by an Irish thug named Joe Howard for refusing him a loan. Capone immediately tracked down Howard in a bar and demanded to know what had happened. Howard took one look at Capone, called him a Dago pimp, and then told him to get lost. At this point, Capone pulled out his pistol and shot Howard in the face. He did this in front of dozens of witnesses. Less than a year later, in January of 1995, Torrio was ambushed by rival gang members. He came within an inch of losing his life, surviving a 9-month prison term slapped on him for operating an illegal brewery. Besides, he decided that he'd had enough of the Chicago madness. By the end of that year, he completely handed the reins over to Capone and disappeared. From Johnny Torrio that was fueled by a highly organized operation that operated largely behind the scenes. In fact, the duplicity was so complete that 99% of the citizens of Cicero never even saw a gangster. Rather, the mob used the government to control the area, with non-compliant merchants being plagued with higher taxes and loss of parking in front of their stores. Well, they quickly got the message, and they got into line. Now Capone set his sights on the north side of Chicago. To make some headway, he first had to subjugate the deadliest gang Chicago had ever known, the Jenners. They operated in the open, even having police protection. The Jenners also had been major suppliers of alcohol to the Torrio Capone outfit, and Capone had even supported them in their battles with other gangs. But after crushing the rival O'Banion gang, the Jenners decided to take over the Capone empire. It would prove to be their undoing. The Jenners selected a couple of Sicilians to assassinate Capone. However, recognizing Capone's power and fearful that such an attempt would lead to their own demise, the Sicilian duo informed Capone of the Jenners' intentions. Al convinced them to turn on the Jenners, and in short order, they had killed 3 of the Jenner brothers. The remaining 3 brothers, well, they fled to Sicily. With the Jenners, well, they were out of the way. Capone now had to deal with the survivors of the O'Banion gang, who had raided Capone's headquarters a number of times. On one particular occasion, they had used 8 touring cars. They first shot blanks to lure people outside, and then followed with live ammunition, hoping to kill Capone on the spot. The ruse, well, it didn't work. Though over 1,000 rounds